basically, this started out as my personal project for graduating the middle years program at my school, which is really important so that I can get my IB diploma. And basically, I did mine on the Marshall Islands, which is where I was from, and I thought it would be interesting to do it on nuclear testing. And little did I know that there would be a lot of hard information about it, and it hit really close to home, so I decided to share this presentation, and I already did it at my synagogue, so I've already been preparing to present it around some multiple audiences. And so a little bit about the Marshall Islands. The Marshall Islands is located in Micronesia in the Pacific Ocean, and they're very small, so if you were to draw a horizontal line from Hawaii to Australia, it would roughly be in the middle. The Marshall Islands is both vast and slight, divided into two island chains, which is Ralik, which is close to the sunset, and Ratak, which is close to the sunrise, and it contains a total of 29 atolls, each made up of small islands called islets, which combined is the equivalent of Washington, D.C. I was born in Megiddo, the capital of the Marshall Islands, part of the Ratak chain. So, a bit of background information about the Marshallese culture. The Marshallese are descended from voyagers, exceptional navigators, and we have skilled storytellers and fishermen. Marshallese agricultural products include coconuts, bananas, papayas, limes, pumpkins, and breadfruit. Breadfruit are fruits that are cooked and taste somewhat like potatoes or freshly baked bread. They are very rich in starch, which transforms to sugar when very ripe, and they can be preserved by fermentation. Fish, chicken, and pork also contribute to the Marshallese diet, and all are commonly served at Gemems, which is the celebration of a baby's first birthday, since the mortality rates were very, very, the babies died way before the first birthday, so it's very important to celebrate that in Marshallese culture. The Marshallese people are very social, so it is considered strange if someone does not visit other people or welcomes visitors. When passing by someone in the Marshall Islands, you may hear the word yakwe, which means hello, goodbye, or love. It's the literal meaning that you are a rainbow. Land is very sacred and is the most important resource in the Marshall Islands. It provides the necessary resources to ensure survival, links the people to their ancestors and their families, and maintains their culture. Although land is represented in wealth, it is not sold or bought amongst the people. Marshallese society, including land, is matrilineal, meaning that it's passed on from the mother to its daughter, and generation to generation through women. And in Marshallese culture, women are just as powerful as men, for they possess rights to land, which give them other rights as well. However, one of the evidence impacts of colonization. However, one of the evident impacts of colonization is that the missionaries completely altered Marshallese society as they converted Marshallese to Christianity. Although colonization may seem related to the topic of radiation, it is vital that you see how colonization led to the U.S. gaining control over the Marshallese and taking their land to use as a test site for the U.S. Nuclear weapons program. The Marshallese were one of the last cultures to be colonized. Before they were taken over by the U.S., the Marshallese were previously colonized by the Spanish, German, followed by the Japanese. As colonial powers took over the Marshall Islands, they tried to dismantle most of the culture, including the indigenous religion, which they replaced with Christianity. Many Marshallese identify the era of the German rule as the beginning of the shift from communal self-sufficiency and family to a focus on individual income generation. Although the missionaries came to convert people to Christianity, the Europeans and others also exploited land of its natural resources. When Japan took over the islands, they wanted the land, and by the late 1930s, they were using it for military purposes as they prepared for World War II. The Japanese used the islands as part of their military strategy to protect Japan. So after Japan attacked the U.S. decided to use island hopping, which was a strategy that the Japanese were already using, basically to gain military bases from Japan to secure the many islands of the Pacific, not only the Marshall Islands. So this was all across the Pacific, as a way to work towards attacking Japan's home islands. This military strategy could help them win the war. The Japanese already secured control of the islands held by the Japanese, using secured control over many of the islands in the Pacific, and this strategy allowed the U.S. to gradually take control of the islands held by the Japanese, using each as a military base from which to move closer to Japan. But it took a lot of time, money, and casualties. Meanwhile, the U.S. created atomic bombs and tested one in Nevada. Then the atomic bombs were used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and many Americans think that this was the only way to stop the war because of the information that was given over the years. But really, the bombs were used because they wanted to show the Soviet Union that they had a powerful new weapon. What it was like for the Marshallese. Okay, so what was it like for the Marshallese during World War II? They suffered greatly under the Japanese, especially on the atolls of Mili, Malaya, and Woche that were bases for the Japanese military. Starvation struck the islands. Just like their predecessors, the Japanese exploited the land and gathered all the existing food resources they could for themselves. Marshallese were banned from taking food from their own trees and were hung, beaten, and beheaded for stealing food from the Japanese. Now we're going to get into how the U.S. got the Marshallese permission. So in the United States developing competition with the Soviet Union, the U.S. wanted to find the location to test its nuclear weapons. The first nuclear test was the Trinity bomb in New Mexico in preparation for possible use on Japan, but this resulted in exposing U.S. civilians to radiation, and they didn't want this, so to reduce the chance to exposing it to American citizens, the U.S. went looking for a good testing site that was far, far away from the U.S., so there would be very little chance for Americans to get exposed to it. The Marshall Islands was thought to be the best candidate because it was an ideal place to conduct nuclear testing because it was very isolated, and so that's why it was chosen. This is where the importance of talking about colonization comes in. So quoting Dr. Holly Barker from her book, Bravo for the Marshallese Regaining Control in a Post-Nuclear, Post-Colonial World, a century after the initial American missionaries arrived, the U.S. government would invoke the name of God to persuade the Marshallese people of the importance of using their lands for nuclear testing sites, for a nuclear weapon test. When the Marshallese were told that they were the chosen people, the ones who would be making a sacrifice to God and to benefit all humankind, they wanted to honor this request made by the United States to express their gratitude for saving them from the Japanese. The Americans said that it was for the good of mankind and that God will thank you. What the U.S. did not tell them was that they may not be able to return to their islands at all, and that it may be completely gone because of the power of the nuclear test, and they would have to endure suffering such as health effects on their island, and effects on their culture. The Marshallese adored the Americans who saved them from years of suffering, and the U.S. government took advantage of that. One of the many approaches that the U.S. used control was to exploit the usefulness of anthropologists. Anthropologists study behavior, and the U.S. government wanted to make sure that they understood the Marshallese people and that the people could understand what they had to say. So to achieve that goal, they hired a bunch of anthropologists. Many anthropologists who study other cultures do work to help preserve those cultures and inform others about it. However, the anthropologists who worked with this government, whose main goal was to show the world that the U.S. was the most powerful country in the world, ended up contributing to the destruction of a culture that they had been studying. The reason why a lot of people do not know much about the Marshall Islands is probably because the U.S. government had suppressed and classified a lot of information about the testing in the Marshall Islands. So Marshallese, Americans, and the international community have been kept in the dark as much as possible. And many are unaware of the number of tests, their yield, and the path of fallout clouds, etc. From 1946 to 1958, the United States conducted 67 tests in the Marshall Islands. It is important that you all know about this testing, how some weapons were so powerful that when they detonated, they completely vaporized islands right off the map. At no time did the U.S. government warn communities about the dangers of fallout or instruct them about safety precautions should they experience any fallout. This includes U.S. soldiers. The government also used these tests to test the effects of radiation on people. The U.S. government researchers treated Marshallese as lab rats and did not give them any treatment that they could possibly help them get better. So one word that everybody knows that is Marshallese is bikini. Bikini is a name of a northern Marshallese atoll. By the way, that means coconut place. Bikini is one of the areas that are completely uninhabitable because of the U.S. nuclear testing. Bikinians were evacuated from their islands so that on March 1st, 1946, the United States could test the largest nuclear weapon the U.S. ever tested. And that was the Bravo hydrogen bomb, and that was the first hydrogen bomb that was ever tested. At 15 megatons, the blast vaporized 3 islands, and the power was 1,000 times the magnitude of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs. 2 out of the 23 weapons that were tested on Bikini Atoll from 1946 to 1958 were hydrogen bombs. And ever since then, the Bikinians have not been able to go back to their islands, and this marks, I think, the 72nd year since the people of Bikini have ever lived in exile away from their beloved homeland. But if you didn't know about the testing, you probably know this Marshallese word. And so, next one. The bikini swimsuit came out on July 5th, and basically, this goes into basically how the nuclear testing affected pop culture in America. So the bikini swimsuit came out on July 5th, 1946. The French fashion designer Louis Réard was inspired by the invention of the bomb, and his idea was to create a swimsuit that was split in half, like the way a nuclear bomb detonates, it splits the atoms in half. The other connection he made with the nuclear bomb was that he meant for this design to have an explosive effect on men. It was worth noting that the Marshall Islands, women traditionally wore topless. Marshallese women did not and still do not view breasts as a sexual object, but the first missionaries that came to the islands insisted that they give up their traditional and practical ways of dressing, and that is why in modern customs in the Marshall Islands, it is considered very inappropriate to wear a bikini because in addition to emphasizing breasts, it doesn't cover the thighs or the shoulders. So one of the things that the U.S. did in the Marshall Islands was to test the nuclear radiation affected on human health. Recently, declassified documents make clear that the U.S. military's long stay in the Marshall Islands, they purposely allowed the Marshallese to be exposed to nuclear radiation so that the scientists for the government can conduct a series of tests of the effects of radiation. And if that's not bad enough, next one. Yeah. This is for all of you who have not been to haunted houses. You may have heard of this, you may have not, but there was a very famous, maybe infamous is the right word, infamous haunted house called Project 4.1. Project 4.1, by the way, is the name of a medical study conducted by the United States government on the atolls of Rongelap and Utrecht. Just to give you a sense of how criminally thoughtless people are here about the nuclear testing, I will read you something that I came across the internet when I was looking for more information about this haunted house. So on an NBC website called Worth the Trip, I found a review on the haunted house called 4.1 promoting this attraction. It said, looking for gory Halloween fun, inspired by a U.S. government medical study, the Warehouse Project 4.1 opens Friday, September 28th, 2012 in Rockville. Built as an urban haunted house, Project 4.1 is constructed to resemble a medical lab gone wrong, filled with zombies, dead bodies, and vicious military men. Actors play residents of the Marshall Islands who were exposed to radioactive fallout in the 1954 Castle Bravo accident and may have suffered long-term harm. So, first of all, this angers me a lot because haunted houses are meant for entertainment, and there was no way that Project 4.1 was fun for any of the Marshallese who had to endure it, and they were not given treatment at all. Second of all, may have suffered long-term harm. They did suffer long-term harm, and by making this a haunted house, it effectively de-emphasizes the horrific aspect of it and tries to make it into something cool. So after the nuclear testing, the U.S. decided that they did not want to clean up after the nuclear testing, so they ended up dumping a lot of nuclear waste into a blast crater on Runit Island, capping it with cement, and called it Runit Dome, turning the island into a temporary nuclear waste facility. The Runit Dome is located on Runit Island, one of the 40 islets in Nuatak Atoll. The U.S. government claimed that they did all they could do to clean up the mess and left the dome containing radioactive refuse, saying that this is now the responsibility of the Marshallese government. The colonial mindset is still weakening havoc on Marshallese people because this nuclear waste, combined with the affluent countries of the world refusing to address climate change, means the survival of the Marshall Islands is itself at stake. I will address the effect of climate change itself on the Marshall Islands later, but let me make clear the connection between climate change and nuclear testing and how this can be directly affect Americans as well. And I don't only mean through immigration from the Marshall Islands. So because of climate change, the Marshall Islands face various rising sea levels, huge storms, floods, droughts, and more. Locals, scientists, and environmental activists fear huge storms may shatter the dome and release its nuclear waste into the Pacific Ocean. They also predict that as the sea level rises, more of its contents are likely to flow into the ocean. Even as climate change continues to threaten the lives of the Marshallese people, the chances of the Runit Dome spilling 111,000 cubic yards of debris into the ocean increase. Already, the radiation has showed up in the Pearl River estuary in China, which is 3,298 miles away. Nowhere on the beaches or the dome is there a sign warning to stay away, that this may have radioactive material present in the area. And this is a huge problem because although the island is uninhabited, some people come to fish in its abundant fishing grounds or to search for scrap metal to salvage, although it's a highly dangerous thing to do. Those who once inhabited the island are very upset, for they want to return. One local said, "We asked Americans, are you going to put a sign on the dome that says don't come here because you might get exposed? Our president asked, are you going to put up a sign so that the birds and turtles also understand?" The U.S. has never actually formally apologized to Marshall Islands for turning it into an atomic testing ground, and they are still yet to pay for the compensation of destroying many islands. And anyways, there's no way to truly compensate for destroying an area with radiation. This brings me to talk about the 177 agreement, which states the government of the United States accepts responsibility for compensation owing to citizens of the Marshall Islands for loss of damaged property and person resulting from the nuclear testing program. Basically, this is a signed agreement saying that the U.S. government will provide remedies to address associated damages and injuries. However, the government had complete control over scientific and medical information, so because they had control over it, they got to decide which was what they which was affected and which islands weren't affected. So they ended up saying that 3 out of 40 affected islands were cleaned up. All but 5 islands and 29 atolls were truly affected by the radiation. It is important to note that before denotating anything, part of the procedure was to test the weather to confirm wind direction and potential radiological hazards that could result from the test. Recently declassified documents demonstrate that some researchers predicted that the winds would push Bravo's radioactive fallout towards inhabited atolls near Bikini Atoll. It also showed that the military ignored these warnings and went on with the testing anyway. The commander of the military team responsible for carrying out the testing program received one of these reports and proposed to treat it like any other member of my staff when I do not agree with them. In short, we will kill it and stick it in a file. So in this part of the presentation, I'm just going to read a piece of the survivor who shares her experience in her own words about what happened on March 1st, 1954. I was living with my parents and some other family members on an islet across the reef from the main islands where we had gone to make copra. On that March morning, my father woke me while it was still pitch dark to cross the reef with some of my friends to the main island to buy some coffee, flour, and sugar. There were 4 of us, 3 girls, and a boy. Well, we were in the middle of the reef between 2 islands when the whole of the western sky lit up. It seemed like it was afternoon, not early morning. The color went from bright white to deep red and then a mixture of both with some yellow. We jumped behind big rocks on the reef. We were too afraid to decide whether to run back to the small islands or run across the reef to the main island. It was Hiroshi, who was the boy, who finally pushed us to run to the main island. Just as we reached this last sandbank, the air around us split open by an awful noise. I cannot describe what it was like. There was a man standing outside the first hut staring at the burning sky. A couple of us threw ourselves onto his legs, and the others ran into his hut, where they threw themselves onto his wife, who was trying to come outside to see what's happening. That afternoon, I found my hair was covered with a white powder-like substance. It had no smell and no taste when I tried tasting it. Nearly all the people on Rongelap became violently ill. Most had painful headaches and extreme nausea and diarrhea. By the time of our evacuation to Kwajalein, all the parts of my body that had been exposed that morning blistered and my hair began to fall out in clumps. I just had to run my fingers through it and they would come out full of dust. After the testing, the Marshallese people were greatly concerned with the damage to their health and long-term implications of removal from their island. So they petitioned to the United States in 1957. We, the Marshallese people, feel that we must follow the dictates of our consciences to bring forth this urgent plea to the United Nations, which has pledged itself to safeguard the life, liberty, and the general well-being to the people of the Trust Territory, of which the Marshallese people are a part. The Marshallese people are not only fearful of the danger to their persons from these deadly weapons in case of another miscalculation, but they are also very concerned for the increasing number of people who are being removed from their island. Land means a great deal to the Marshallese. It means more than just a place where you can plant your food, crops, and build your houses, or a place where you can bury your dead. It is the very life of the people. Take away their land, and their spirit goes also. William Lodge, who was a U.S. ambassador to the UN, asked the Secretary General not to introduce the petition to the UN until all tests were completed. The Secretary General agreed, and so it took nearly 4 years for the UN to finally consider the petition. The U.S. government continued to speak for the Marshallese people at the UN, and so the Marshallese people were, as a result, were powerless to stop any further destruction to their islands. Because of the 67 nuclear tests, the Marshall Islands had the highest rate of cancer in the world. The people who had never seen snow thought that radioactive fallout was snow because it was white and fell from the sky. So when the children stuck their tongues out to eat it, they ended up consuming it, and the many other ways in which they were exposed to radiation caused them to die or get sick. Women and children were most affected, especially pregnant women for radiation-caused deformities in the babies that they were carrying, and it often caused the mothers to get sick. Not only did it affect the people, it also affected wildlife in living in the area. Radiation is not only harmful when consumed by humans, it also has similar effects on fish and other animals. Although fish is one of the most important resources, after the testing due to radiation, the Marshallese became poisoned by consuming fish that were fine to eat. The Marshallese were once amazing navigators, creating stick and shell shards as teaching tools and using many signs for navigation. Although many of the ancient skills are being lost, the people are trying to regain them, but these skills are based on their homeland. Women do not have the same roles as they did before because of all those changes, and they have lost the relative equality they once had. Men are now the head of the household and have more power than women do. Because of the introduction of radiation, the islands have much few natural resources upon which it is safe to rely. And as a result, they are eating a lot of imported and unhealthy food. Because of the continuing impact of the nuclear tests that completely vaporized some islands and made many more forever uninhabitable, the traditions of cultivating and passing down land to future generations are no longer possible in the way that there had been, especially for the land most affected by nuclear testing. And now climate change is having similar impacts. The Marshallese have far lower carbon emissions than many countries. We, the Marshallese people, are in danger of losing our entire ancestral homeland due to the actions of people like us Americans. May we be wiser on the issue of climate change than the U.S. government was in its determination to test nuclear weapons. So, next. As you can see, the Marshallese people have been suffering for so long because of the ignorance of our world leaders, who still to this day are still making the same dumb decisions that heavily impact the Marshallese and their ability to draw and honor their culture. And now that because climate change has entered the picture, we are now looking at massive destruction because of the increased strength in storms and the possibility of disappearing islands. This frustrates me a lot because the Marshallese Islands is home to me, and seeing people not know what the Marshall Islands is or just not care about it shows how ignorant America is. I mean, at the same time the testing was done, in this country, everyone's TV programs were interrupted so that they could hear the updates of the nuclear testing, so they could be a part of this historical moment. How could anyone forget about the country where the testing was done and which will suffer for centuries because of it? Although I've mentioned climate change a few times throughout this presentation, I made a dedicated section specifically to talk about climate change in the Marshall Islands. This is important to me that I add this in my presentation because I cannot stress enough that climate change is still affecting the Marshall Islands, whether they live in the Marshall Islands or not. I believe that no one will do anything about climate change until they truly know what danger they are putting others in. That is why I'm going to show you this movie. Hopefully, it will open your eyes and you can understand why the Marshallese culture is a culture that we need to help preserve, and we can do future movie nights so that you can learn even more about this precious ancient culture. So, yeah. The end.